virtual environment. So during the breaks, feel free to jump on any of the tables and like start talking to other people. I think that's it from my side. Thank you very much. And Kevin, can you please put on the first speaker?
Hello. Thank you, Minos, for that great introduction. I guess I'll get straight to it. So just let me figure out how to share screen. Okay. So can you all see my screen? I don't know why it's so small. Let me just figure out what's going on here. Okay, so I can't make it bigger, but you'll see. I see that you can put it right there. So if there's anything that you need to see closer up, I think you can put it on full screen mode. Okay, cool. So I'm Anna Cidre. Today I'm going to be talking about web components for authentication, the what, the why, and the how. So a bit about me, I am a developer advocate engineer at Auth0. Auth0 is a flexible drop-in solution to add authentication and authorization services to your applications. So if you have any questions on Auth0 or about me, or just want to say hi or about web components, please feel free to reach out either here later or via Twitter. My Twitter handle is @AnnaCidre_. I'm also a very active member in the community, so I'm the organizer of NG Spain, which is an Angular conference here in Spain, but due to the current situation, this year's event will not be held. I'm also very passionate about diversity, so I'm a Women Techmaker ambassador, and I'm also an organizer of Girls Tech, which is a local group for women in tech. So without further ado, let's jump into today's talk. Let's start by figuring out what a web component is. So what is a web component? A web component is a component that is completely platform agnostic. And the main goal is to have encapsulation so that you won't have any styling or behavioral leakages in your app. They're also reusable packages, which is going to gain a lot of interoperability. However, later on, we're going to go a bit more deeper into this and see what I mean by it. So when we tend to think of web components, we tend to think of dumb UI components. However, this is so not true. Web components can be smart components too. And in this talk, I'm going to take you through making a dumb component, and then we're going to smarten it up. Next, web components actually consist of three main technologies. HTML template, which is our HTML tag called template, and that's where we put all of the template of the web component in. Then we have custom element, and the custom element is how we create a HTML tag, or we can even extend or improve an existing one. And last but not least, we have Shadow DOM. Now, Shadow DOM is what's going to allow us to have that encapsulation that I was just talking about, so that we can prevent any styling or behavioral leakages in or out. So to get a better understanding of these three technologies, we're going to start by creating a DOM component. And this is what we're going to create. It's a simple login button. As you can see, the HTML tag is called login dash button. Note that when you do create a custom element, you have to add a dash and also make it like understandable and readable for best practice for your future self and for your fellow developers, because when you're going over your code, you might not know what's going on there. So let's create this login button, and what we're going to do is be able to style it from the outside. And to do so, what we're doing is creating the template. As you can see, it's a pure button, and all it has is an ID and login there. We also have the style tags, and I'll get into styling a bit later because we have to take a tiny bit longer on this part too, because it's very important. Next, what we're doing is we're calling the class login button element, and it's extending from the HTML element. And it's doing this so that we can actually inherit all of the features from the HTML element class, and also so that it's recognized as a DOM element. Then we have our constructor and super, and we call super inside of our constructor so that we have access to all of the APIs that we need there. Next step, we're going to add the shadow DOM. So here what we're doing is basically two simple lines of code to be able to have the encapsulation. And the first line, as you can see, has mode open. This basically means that we're giving the possibility to other developers to manipulate the structure of the component via JavaScript. Now, you can always close that, but in general, I would recommend that you keep it open because you never know how other developers are going to use your web component, right? So let's take an example. I might create an image gallery, and on a web app or a website, it's just an image gallery, right? There's not much more functionality you can give to it. However, if you take this mobile and make it native, then it might become a page slider on a mobile app. And although you didn't really have that intention when creating the web component, other people might see use for that. So you never know, right? Now, on the second line of code, all we're doing is cloning the template that we created, and instead of adding it to the DOM, we add it to the shadow DOM. Right, and now we need to define our custom element. We need to give it a name. So to do so, we call custom elements.define, we pass the name, and we pass the login button element there. And that's basically it. That's how we create a dumb web component. Now, I talked about styling, and I do want to stop here a second because the possibility, or the probability, better said, of people wanting a green login button is pretty low. They might want an orange one, or a pink one, or a purple one, or maybe just transparent. You never know. So you have to give the possibility of people to style the web component easily without having to access it through any like hacks or whatever. And to keep it simple, because they need to style their web component or your web component depending on like personal preferences or maybe even corporate identity or whatever they may be. And there's two ways to go about this. The first way is through custom CSS properties. Now, this is the preferred way because the browser is almost prepared. Obviously, Internet Explorer is always Internet Explorer, but there are polyfills, so this is really good. And here what we're doing is basically in our templates, we give it a CSS variable. Note that CSS variables always must start with a dash dash and then the name. So we go into our CSS, we give it, for example, background color, that's the property background color in there. We give it a variable. The name of the variable is background color. That's just my choice because I wanted to keep it more legible, but you can call it whatever you want. And then a default value so that the button has a default background color. And then if you want to change it, what you would do is inside the web component, inside the login button, you would access the style attribute, and there you'd call the name of the variable, which was dash dash background color, and add the value you want there, which is the color. The second option, and this option is really good if you have a bigger web component or a more complex web component. So for example, instead of just having a button, you might have a form or a card. And that way you might have certain parts of the web component that you actually want to allow developers to style, but there might be other parts of the component that you don't want them to style. And you can do this through the CSS shadow paths. The problem with this is that browsers aren't quite ready. I know Safari is working on it, so hopefully Safari will be ready. And that will make a huge difference already. So how will we do this? I just want to note that the source underneath, right at the bottom of the slide there, is a really good article, a more in-depth article about the CSS part pseudo class. So go ahead and read it. It's really amazing. And this is actually one of the examples from that source. So what she's doing here is she's allowing the div and the input to be accessible to style from the outside. However, there's another div that's not going to be stylable. And then how does the developer actually style this? So they go to their style sheets, they call the web component, they call the part pseudo class, they give the part pseudo class the name that's in there, and then they can add whatever properties they want to there, whichever ones are accessible, right? So this is really good for many reasons. Like one of the reasons is that it's less bug prone because when you have CSS custom variables, you have to keep adding each variable name individually. However, here you just add all of the property names. And then you can also add more pseudo classes, so hover, placeholder, whatever you want to here. Now we're going to add it to the button because even though it's not a very complex web component, we can still use this. So as you can see, I have the part attribute here and I'm calling it custom button. And then what I'm doing is when I want to style it, here it's just inside a style tag, but you can see it's the name of the web component, which is web login button. the part pseudo class, the name of the part, and then you just put in the properties and values there. And that's it. We've created a dumb web component. So that was pretty okay. Now you've got a very simple and basic understanding of what web components are. I think the next topic is what is authentication? Now, authentication is the process of confirming an identity. And what do I mean by this? Well, it's when a user or an application proves they are who they say they are by providing valid credentials. Now, these credentials tend to be a username or password, but they can be used with other factors. And these factors tend to fall into three categories: what you know, what you have, or what you are. So you can think of a fingerprint or maybe an email or an SMS. It's when you have more than one authentication process, right? We call it multi-factor authentication. And this is actually like best practice because it secures your app even better, right? Now, I tend to hear authentication and authorization used interchangeably. However, this is not quite right. So let's take a look and see what authorization is. Authorization is when you verify what a user has access to. So once the user or application is granted access to an API, after the API determines the extent of the permissions that it should assign. So let's take a moment to think about that. So once the valid credentials are provided, that's when authorization kicks in, and it's when it knows what sort of access it should grant to each user, basically. But I must say that access to a resource is protected by both authentication and authorization. However, in this talk, we're just going to focus on authentication. But that doesn't mean that with web components, you cannot use authorization too. So now how can we combine both web components and authentication? There are many ways to go about this, and what I'm going to talk about now is more on a higher level. It's not just for authentication, but I will be using authentication as an example, right? So like I mentioned, excuse me, go drink some water. It's very hot here in Spain. As I mentioned, with web components, you can gain maximum interoperability. And to give you a better understanding of what I mean by this, I'm going to give you an example. Now, imagine that you're in a company that has several product teams. And on each of those product teams, they obviously have a product, but they might have their own design too. And they might be using their own framework. Now, say there were three product teams, one that works with Angular, one that works with Vue, and another one that works with Polymer. Now, they all want a login process. And normally, when it's from the same company, they all want a good user experience friendly login process, right? Where they kind of know that it belongs to the same company, even though they're different products. They want a good experience. Now, instead of creating this login process 3 times and getting 3 times the headaches and 3 times the sleepless nights and whatever, what they could do is create one web component and then share it across teams. And that way, you just have to implement it very easily, which we're going to go into in just a second. But before I do, I want to note that if you want to know if your framework actually is web component friendly, I really recommend that you go check out this website called Custom Elements Everywhere. There, it will tell you how web component friendly your framework is. So Angular is web component friendly, Vue is, React, not really, but hopefully I'll get there one day. But I was talking about easy implementation. So with web components, they are so easy to implement. If we take a look here, on the left is an SDK, right? And SDKs are already a really good way about going to implement something, whether it's a service or whatever we might want to implement into our web application. And on the right, we have a web component. So an SDK might take a couple of hours, might take a couple of days, normally not longer than that. So you're not reinventing the wheel, you're not spending months on building this thing from scratch. However, a web component is pretty simple. All you need to do is add this HTML. Oh, and don't forget to install and save it before you do that. Now I want to talk about flexibility because web components are really, really, really flexible, both on the inside and the outside, right? So both for the developer who's actually developing the web component and for developers who are using it. Now I can give whatever HTML attributes I want to to that web component. And we're going to see how to do this in just a bit. But say that I wanted to allow to have a domain and client ID attribute because that's what we need to make this component smart, then we can totally do that. I'm not going to go too much into styling again because we've already been through that. But yeah, styling is another way of gaining flexibility, and you have two ways about going about it. So there's CSS custom properties and CSS shadow paths. Next, you have slots, which makes you even more flexible because slots basically work as placeholders, which you then add into your web component, and then the developer can choose whether they want to use that or not. Now take a look at this example. We have two buttons here, a login button, a logout button, and then we have a slot which has a name of description. Best practice is always to add the attribute name and give it a name, because if you have more than one slot, the browser is going to render it randomly. So remember to name your slots. And then the developer can decide whether they want to add this slot or not. Now I'm going to provide you with some examples that we could use to make authentication more simple. It might be a web component that shows a login screen and all buttons for login with social media. It might be a web component that shows when the user's logged in, it might show their name, or it might show their profile photo, or it might show a logged out button. It's up to you. What we're going to build right now is a simple login button that when you click on it, it is going to use the Auth0 SDK, which will do the authentication process for you. And once they're logged in, it's going to show a logout button. So remember that DOM component we created right at the beginning? Well, we're going to go and make it smart. So like I said, we will be using the Auth0 SDK. And to do so, all we need to do is do an npm install auth0 spar.js. Then we import it. And then what we're going to do is when we create where we created our class, we're going to add the domain and client ID properties because these are the attributes that we want to use. And then we pass empty strings because this is the information that's going to be going in from the outside, so we need to keep it empty. And then we have some getters and setters. We have getters and setters on both the domain and the client ID. And if you notice on both setters, we have right at the bottom, this.build auth0 client. Now we use this because we need to rebuild the auth0 client whenever the values of the domain and or client properties change. Next, we have the observed attribute static property that returns an array with the names of the components attributes. So this property is asking the browser to be notified when the value of any of these attributes changes. And then you can capture these changes from the browser by implementing the attribute change callback. And this is actually one of the custom element reactions, and you can implement it to handle some events in the lifecycle of the component. Next, we have the connected callback, which is another custom element reaction. And this code is creating an instance of the Auth0 client. It then has a listener for the click event, which we're going to look at in just a second. It then manages the result of authentication and updates the UI based on the current authentication status. So in our event listener, what we have here is basically getting the current authentication status of the user, and it's calling the login and logout method accordingly. So let's go into these two methods. And what you can see here is that these methods are invoking the login with redirect and the logout methods, and these are actually of the Auth0 client. Now, if we go back to our connected callback, you'll see our update UI method, which we're going to go into quickly. And all this is doing is displaying the correct text on the login button based on the current authentication status. And then we have the handle redirect callback method, which manages the response coming from the Auth0 server after authentication. And then we're basically done. So this would be our web component, and then you'd have to add the domain and client ID from your Auth0 dashboard, and then it would work perfectly well. Now, if you want to take a better look at this code, I recommend you go to my GitHub. You can take a screenshot. I'll give you a couple of seconds because this is something that tends to be asked, but I will be sharing my slides on Twitter later. So no need to rush. And what this login button would do is basically when you click on it, it would take you to this page here, and then it would show you the logout button. It's pretty simple, but it's very efficient. And because it's a web component, it's very, very small. It's not heavy at all. Now, you may have seen that I created the web component with vanilla JavaScript. And yes, it does result in a lot of lines of code. So there are other libraries and frameworks out there that actually help you build web components. And these are a few of them. So we have hybrids, we have Stencil, Slim, Skate, and Angular Elements. And in the middle there is actually my favorite, and it's Lit Element. And why is it my favorite? Well, because it takes care of a lot of like these connected callbacks for you. It has this nice render function, which is pretty smart too. And I really recommend that you just go try them out, because I know a lot of React developers who have tried web components are like, oh, this is very simple. This is just like JSX. It's very similar, and there's nothing for you to worry about. I really recommend that you just try it. And another thing that actually has worried a lot of developers in the past, mainly because when web components first came out, browsers were not ready at all. And we had polyfills, but the polyfills were so huge. There was something like 16K. And they didn't quite work as expected, especially with Shadow DOM. There was still some like leakages and stuff going on. But what about the browser today? As you can see, and thanks to Chromium on Edge, everything is fully stable. We also use ES modules to import the components. So yeah, everything's stable, the browser's ready, and there's nothing to be worried about. Just go ahead and try it. I see I have a tiny bit more time, but I'm here if you want any questions. I'm happy to. I'm not sure if now's the time for questions. Yes, please add your questions there for Anna to ask at the end of the talk. Okay, great. And thank you so much for having me. This is my Twitter, and thank you. Do I have any questions? Slides. Okay, yeah, I'll share the slides here with you in a bit.
Ciao, Anna.
Hi.
Thank you for your talk. It was amazing.
Thanks. It's really hot today, so like.
I can imagine, and like we're all stuck inside.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you do have any questions, you can write them in the Q&A section on the right. And if you do not have any questions for now, we can just go to networking view, if I'm correct. I'm not sure that is the right name for it, where you'll see an image with bunch of tables, and in group of 6